Last week I drew a lion. I also drew a lion a very long time ago when I was new to colour pencils. It was in fact the very first thing I drew with proper colour pencils. It's the first thing I drew with my polychromas. So I thought it would be fun today to compare the two lions and see how I went from this lion to this. Now, my old lion, I wouldn't say is something I'm particularly proud of. It's not awful, but I don't think it's good. Whereas I am genuinely pleased with my new one. Obviously, I use different references, but they're the same subject, so thought this would be fun. Now, before I get into the things that I think I did wrong before, I do want to give past me a little pat on the back. One of the main things that I see people doing wrong all the time is not getting down an accurate sketch. And actually, my old lion does appear to be in proportion. I do know that I would have used the grid method for this, and I did take the time to get that aspect right. So well done me. Let's talk about the first thing that helped this improve. Now, before I talk about any techniques, I firstly want to cover paper. Now, I feel like all I do is talk about paper, but that is because it's so important. On this old drawing, I used sketch paper. To be fair, it is semi-decent sketch paper. It's thick, but it is still cheap. The main issues with me using sketch paper like this is that I wasn't able to build up any layers. It looks a lot like I built up about 3 layers and then just went in really hard with the pencil, which is why it looks so flat. The paper that I used for this new lion is Bristol board. Bristol board I find really good for drawing on. It's really nice and smooth and can take loads of layers. If you're interested in the particular paper I used for my new lion, I do have a link in the description. So let's not dwell too much on paper. This actually feeds very nicely into my next point, which is I didn't layer up. Now, yeah, that is partly due to the paper, but as I said, I do know that I wouldn't have done it anyway. And when you look at the drawing, you can see I probably used about 2 colours and then just put really hard pencil over the top, and that's why it looks so flat. It looks like I used one pencil to just make some hairish flicks with the pencil, another pencil to go over the top of that, and then I just shaded really heavily. Compare that to what I did for this new lion. I built up so many layers. I started off by putting down a base and gradually building that up to get the general underlying colour. I then put a variety of different colours with flicking motions to build up some hair texture, and then even on top of that I put more glazes of colour and shading over the top just to add even more depth and detail. I don't know how many layers I would have built up on here, but I do know it was a lot. It was certainly more than 3. I find it easiest while layering to work from the lightest colour to the darkest and then usually go back to the lightest. And I find this the easiest way to work methodically to do this, which is not something I used to do. Next up, something that is very important that I definitely didn't have when I drew my old lion is I didn't swatch out my colours. Now, swatching is where you take a sheet of paper, preferably the paper that you're going to draw your final piece on, and you draw little squares with each colour pencil. So I work from the lightest, the very lightest I can get that pencil, onto the darkest. I lay them all out, label them all up, and then I can see what the pencil looks like on the piece of paper. I don't rely on what the pencil looks like on the pencil casing or what the lead looks like, because it could look completely different when it's on the paper. This isn't something that I used to do when I drew this lion. That meant that I was frequently taken by surprise on what the colour actually looks like. And I think you can see that relatively clearly when you look at this jaw here. I obviously saw a little bit of green here, but I can only assume that this came out brighter than I was expecting, or I don't know why I would have done this. With my new drawing, I knew what every colour looked like before I put it down, and it's ended up with a much more natural coloured lion. I think the old one looks very bright orange. So I so highly recommend swatching your colours. It will improve your art, and it's free, so why not? Before I get into point number 4, if you would like to see more of my new lion, I do have it available on my Patreon. I have a full tutorial as well as real-time footage. I also provide the sketches and swatches of every colour I use. Now, something on this old drawing which is blindingly obvious to me now is that it both has not enough contrast and also too much contrast. For example, now I don't have the reference, so I don't actually know what I was seeing, but I can only assume that round the top up here it's supposed to be darker. It looks very, very light and washed out. In comparison to that, how dark I've drawn the eyes, nose and mouth just looks ridiculous. I feel like I just went in really hard with the black and didn't really worry about anything else. That looks way too harsh on the rest of the lion. So actually, when I compare that to my new lion, there is a lot more areas throughout the picture that does get far deeper. So for example, around the mane, I am going as dark in some of these areas as I am around the mouth, for example. Another thing to note is actually with my new lion, I didn't use the black pencil at all. The very darkest I went was dark umber, which is the darkest brown I have in my set of Prismacolors. But I didn't want to touch the black because I did think it would end up making the drawing look too harsh. Now, I'm not saying that you should never use black in your drawings. I'm just saying that you should try and use it maybe a bit more sparingly or use other colors with it so it's not just black on its own. I think there is one more very obvious way that I improved my art. Now, I actually, on my old art, can see that I tried to use a technique that I used on my new art. So if I talk you through the technique and explain how to do it correctly, I can then tell you what I did wrong before. So on my new lion, what I did was I built up a lot of colour, particularly around the mane, starting with a very light layer and then gradually working my way up to the darker layers. When I got to the end of the drawing, I then used a craft knife so I could scrape away the top layers of pencil. This then revealed the layers that I put down at the very beginning, which was on my new drawing a very light yellow. And by doing this, it meant I could add in lots of little, I call them baby hairs or flyaway hairs in the mane, and it made it look more realistic. I was also able to scrape in the whiskers towards the end and then put those back in with a lighter colour, and it just made the whole thing much easier. The reason it didn't work on the old drawing is basically a combination of all of the things I've mentioned. So because I had the wrong paper, I wasn't able to build up enough layers, and that meant that there wasn't really anything to scrape away. I then, probably because it wasn't working, scraped way too hard and ended up damaging the paper. Now, probably the best reaction to this would have been to just say the drawing's done and walk away, but instead it seems like what I did was go a little bit crazy with the Jelly Roll pen. I put Jelly Roll pen everywhere. And then I didn't go over the top of it with any colour pencil. I clearly didn't know where to stop. I tried using a technique, it didn't work, and I also didn't know when to walk away. My point is, if you want to use a technique, make sure that you know how that technique works before you just crack on. So if you're wanting to improve your art, my main tips for you is to firstly use the right paper. Do some research, find what works best for you, but do make sure that you can build up layers on it. Then you want to actually build up some layers, and you'll be able to do this with the colours that you won't be surprised by because you have swatches. Make sure that you do build up enough contrast, but don't just go crazy with the black. And make sure you learn the techniques before you use them. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to know more about mistakes I made as a beginner artist, check out 8 things I wish I knew as a beginner artist. Happy drawing, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.